morning. That was close. This church does not have a celebrity pastor. If I forget to bring the pulpit out, it does not come out. Okay, so there is a story about a missionary who a long time ago went to preach the gospel to an unreached people group. And I think this is more of a parable than a true story. But anyway, this missionary went to preach the gospel to an unreached people group, and he met with the chief of the village. And the chief of the village asked him, "What do I have to give to your God in order to be accepted by him? What do I have to give to your God in order to join your religion? Do I have to give him my blanket?" And the missionary said, "No, you don't have to give him your blanket." And he said, "Do I have to give him my pottery?" And he said, "No, you don't have to give him your pottery." And he said, "Do I have to give him my weapons?" And he said, "No, you don't have to give him your weapons." And he said, "Well, what do I have to give your God?" And the missionary said, "Well, my God wants you. Like, he wants you to give him you." And the village chief said, "Well, your God is smart. Because if he gets me, he gets my blanket and my pottery and my weapons." And I think there's something to that. Like, I think there's something in us that realizes that the village chief was right. That if I belong to God, then everything that belongs to me belongs to God. And so that brings us to today's topic, which is, what are we to do with money? We are in a series called Way of Wisdom. We've been preaching through the book of Proverbs for a long time now. This is now part 21. And the first part of this series, we were preaching verse by verse, chapter by chapter through Proverbs, because the first 9 chapters of Proverbs are more like a normal book of the Bible. You can just preach through them like you'd preach through any book. Then you get to chapter 10, and that's where Proverbs becomes what it's famous for, where it is a list of Proverbs. From chapter 10 on, you have all of these individual Proverbs, most of which are just one sentence long, and they are unrelated to the next sentence that's found in the book of Proverbs. And so for several weeks now, once we got past chapter 9, we started preaching on Proverbs, but instead of doing whole chapters and taking 20 topics at a time, we've been taking one topic at a time and finding different Proverbs throughout the book of Proverbs and bringing them together and talking about them topic by topic. And so here we are as we're preaching through Proverbs, and we come to the topic of money. If you are new here this morning, especially if this is your very first week at our church and you're one of those people that go, "I don't like it when they talk about money at church," sorry. Come back next week when we won't be talking about it, okay? But that happens to be the topic this week. And it sort of was the topic last week. Last week is where we sort of introduced the topic, and today we finish it up. Last week's sermon was called Rich and Poor, and we talked somewhat about money, but I would say it was a fairly general sermon. Like, we talked about big picture ideas when it comes to money. We talked about money not being inherently sinful. We talked about how laziness leads to poverty, because Proverbs says that over and over and over again. We talked about the fact that you can be poor and be on the right path, following God's ways. We talked about the fact that God cares about the vulnerable, like widows and orphans. But we did not cover a whole lot of what to do with money. And so that's what we saved for today. What should you do with money? I'm going to give you 6 things this morning to do with money. I have 6 points in this sermon, and the 6 points are 6 things that Proverbs tells us to do with money. And as I go through the 6 things, I just want to let you know I'm planning on spending a disproportionate amount of time on the first one. So as I talk about point 1, there might come a point where you go, "Whoa, there are 6 of these? Is this sermon ever going to end?" And I just wanted to let you know I plan on spending a bunch of time on the first point, and then probably points number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 will go much quicker. Okay, so 6 things to do with money. Here they are. Number 1, what should you do with money? Number 1, don't trust in it. That's the first point. What are you supposed to do with money? According to Proverbs, don't trust in it. And if you are picky, you might go, "Well, that's not a thing to do with money. That's a thing to not do with money." Okay, you got me. But I don't know a better way to phrase it. Don't trust in wealth. Proverbs 11, verse 28 says, "Anyone trusting in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like foliage." There are multiple Proverbs that talk about the problem of trusting in riches. And here we see that righteousness is contrasted with trusting in riches, that there is a flourishing that can happen because of righteousness, but there is a falling that happens when someone trusts in riches. There's another verse that we can look at, and this is one that we looked at last week toward the end of the sermon. I'm kind of picking up this week where we left off last week in some ways, because we talked about not trusting in wealth as the last thing we talked about last week. So this is a verse we looked at, Proverbs 18, verses 10 and 11. It says, "The name of Yahweh is a strong tower. The righteous run to it and are protected. And then the next proverb says, a rich man's wealth is his fortified city. In his imagination, it is like a high wall. That is, the people who are righteous, their security is found in Yahweh, right? The name of Yahweh is their strong tower. That's where they go for protection. That's where they go. That's where I'm going to be safe. God is the one who keeps me safe. However, there are some people who are rich and look at their wealth and go, no, this is what's going to keep me safe. My security is found in my stuff. In my imagination, it is this high wall that no one will be able to scale. I will be safe. I will be okay. Not because I run and am protected by Yahweh, but because I got a bunch of stuff that will keep me secure. And so I thought about saying this week, there is something about money that tempts us to trust in it rather than trusting in God. And in fact, I did say that last week. I said those words. In fact, I'm going to say some stuff this week that I said last week, but just maybe from a different angle this time. It won't be exactly the same, but there's going to be a little bit of overlap. And so last week I said there is something about money that tempts us to trust in it rather than God. And I thought about that this week, and I don't regret saying it. I think it's true. But there's another way to look at it, because it almost seems like the only way you can say that money tempts us to trust in it rather than God, for that to be true, you kind of almost have to personify money, right? That money is tempting you. But that's not literally true. Like money or riches don't literally tempt you. They just sit there, right? Money is just stuff. It does not tempt us like a person might tempt us. It's not like if you're walking past a Porsche, it doesn't actually go, psst, don't care about poor people, buy me instead. Like that doesn't happen. The Porsche just sits there and does nothing, right? And so I think that that's something that's helpful to realize, that even though trusting in money is a temptation for us, it's not because money itself is wicked, a wicked person trying to tempt us. No, money's just sitting there. It is inherently not wicked. When we said that last week, but I want to talk about it from a different angle because I thought about it this week. Just was listening to other pastors preach, and it just sort of dawned on me some different thoughts that I had all come together. One of the ways I think we can know that money is not inherently sinful is because money is just stuff that God made, or stuff that humans made out of stuff that God made. But God made a world. He made a good world. And the stuff that we call riches or wealth or money typically is just stuff that God made. And that's, I think, important to understand. And I think maybe the older you get, maybe the easier it is to understand that. I think when you're a kid, sometimes you think of money not as the stuff of this world, but you just think of money like as cash. Right? When I was a kid, like money is like green pieces of paper. That's money. Coins are money. The little numbers that are in our bank accounts, that's money. But really, money, when someone is wealthy, it could be that they don't have stacks of cash. It could be that they just have stuff. You following me? I think it was DuckTales that ruined it for me. When I was a kid, and I don't know how many of you grew up with DuckTales, but remember DuckTales? The main character's name was Scrooge McDuck. He was the richest guy in the whole land, and he had a money bin. Okay, it was this 12-story tall vault that was filled with gold coins that he would swim around in. And if you're 7 and that's what you grow up watching, I think that can help you to start thinking, oh, I guess that's what makes you rich. Rich people are people who have like a vault in their home filled with cash. But you could be someone who's very wealthy and there's very little cash in your home, right? You could be someone that owns a house in Ocala and owns a house on the Rainbow River and has a condo in Miami and a condo in New York and a ranch in Colorado and a little cabin in North Carolina, and we would say, you're rich, right? Why? Because you have 6 houses. Not because you're swimming around in green pieces of paper, but because you have stuff. And that's how they measured wealth, even in the times of the Bible as well. It wasn't by dollars. In fact, they didn't even have dollars. If you go back to the Old Testament, they didn't even have really currency, I don't think. If you look at the book of Job, Job is called a wealthy man, and the way that he is, like what he has that causes the Bible to measure him a wealthy man, anybody remember? Yeah, he has thousands of sheep. He has thousands of camels. So you go, how is he rich? Animals, that's how he's rich. He has a bunch of stuff. And so when we start thinking, well, is money sinful? Well, no, because money is sheep, right? Money is camels. Money is the stuff that somebody has. This is even true at the time that Proverbs is written, okay, which is later on, a later period than Job, but it's still true when Proverbs is written. If you look at Proverbs chapter 27, verse 23, you still see this kind of way that wealth is talked about. Proverbs 27, verse 23. It says this, "Know well the condition of your flock, and pay attention to your herds. For wealth is not forever, and not even a crown lasts for all time." Now, if you don't understand what I've been saying, and you think that money simply is the pieces of paper that we exchange, then you're going to look at a verse like this and go, that's a weird Bible verse. It almost seems like he changed topics in the middle of the sentence. He's clearly talking about animals, right? Condition of your flock, pay attention to your herds. Why? Because wealth is not forever. Why in the world did he change topics right in the middle of the sentence? And the answer is he didn't change topics in the middle of the sentence. The wealth that he's talking about in the second half of the sentence is referring back to the animals in the first half of the sentence. And so when we think about money, I think if it's good for us to think about that. Money is the stuff of this earth. The reason why money's not evil is because sheep aren't evil, houses aren't wicked, boats aren't evil, right? Money is just stuff. And so if that's true, though, so if it's true that money is stuff, right, if the actual money, the thing that we call money is not really worth anything, like the only reason you like the green pieces of paper is because you can go to Publix and exchange it for stuff, right? It would be meaningless if you couldn't. And so once we start realizing that wealth or riches is just the stuff of this earth, then we can start to go, okay, well then it's not sinful in and of itself because it's stuff that God made. And yet we know that it's true that money can tempt us to trust in it. Therefore, if the stuff is not actually bad, it's not actually sitting there and come over here and sin, then how can we say this? And so I think the other way to say it, and rather than saying money tempts us to trust in it rather than God, is to say there is something about the sinful human condition that gravitates toward trusting in the things God made more than trusting in Him. That since the stuff is not sinful and it's not actually trying to get us to sin, there's something about the sinful human condition that gravitates toward putting our trust in the stuff that God created rather than in the Creator Himself. And that's idolatry. Like when you trust in what God has made rather than trusting in God, that's idolatry. That's idol worship. We don't think of it as idolatry because we tend to think of idolatry as like situations where, like in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, when the Israelites get out of Egypt and they're out in the wilderness and Moses is gone for a while and Aaron takes all of the gold that the people have and he brings it together and he melts it down and he creates that golden calf and then they all start worshiping that golden calf. And we look at the stories like that and we go, yeah, look how dumb they were for worshiping a statue instead of the true God. But when we trust in things that God has made, boats, houses, sheep, camels, whatever, when we trust in the things that God has made rather than Him, that's idolatry, just without a statue. There's one other observation I want to give you while we're on point number one, and then I'll get into the rest. But there's a guy that I like a lot. He's a pastor named Tim Keller, and he is a pastor in Manhattan. And I've been listening to his Proverbs series recently, and when he was talking about money, one of the things he said, and I thought this was helpful, so I just want to share it with you. And I did not write down word for word what he said, so this is just kind of a paraphrase, the best as I can remember it. But he said, in talking about this idea of idolatry, I don't even know if he used that word, but this idea of trusting in created things rather than the Creator, that different people might do that in different ways so that the idolatry of money doesn't always look the same in every individual life. I specifically remember that he said there are some people who find their significance in wealth, and there are some people who find their security in wealth. And if riches are your significance, you're going to act differently than if riches are your security. Right? He said, you can treat wealth or riches or money kind of like God. Like they can play the place of they can play the place of God in your life. But it'll look different because the person who depends upon riches for significance is going to be someone who spends a lot more. Right? Because the wealth, things, money is what makes me significant. So I'm going to get fancy clothes and have a fancy car and have a fancy house. I'm going to be much spendier if the way that I'm relating to wealth is that it is what brings me significance. However, the person who thinks of wealth as their security, they're going to act different. Even though they're still treating wealth like a god, they're going to be saving a whole lot more. They're going to be wearing clothes from Walmart. They're going to be driving a Honda from 2006. And they're going to be putting stuff in the bank, in the bank, in the bank, in the bank, because ultimately what's going to keep me safe, my stuff is going to be the thing that really protects me. And it's interesting to think that like both people could be treating money like God, but they look completely different. And this person over here could actually look at this person over here and go, look at that person treating money like their security. I don't do that, right? Let's buy some more. And then the person over here can be like, look at those people, the love of money and always having these fancy things. Not me, okay? I'm going to store up some more, I'm going to store up some more, I'm going to store up some more, because my protection is really, the thing that's really going to keep me safe is whatever I can store up for me. And so I thought that was helpful, and I share it with you. Not to say that spending is a sin, because it's not. And not to say that saving is a sin, because it's not. But just to say that love of money and idolatry of wealth is a tricky thing. And it doesn't look the same in everybody's life. It's not a sin to spend. It's not a sin to save. In fact, as I go through the rest of these things, the rest of the list of what we're supposed to do with money, we're going to find out that spending is one of the things you're supposed to do with money. And saving is one of the things you're supposed to do with money. But there's a way to overdo it, because there's a way to value created things more than the Creator. It's a tricky thing. Trusting in riches is a tricky thing, and so it seems to me that what we need to do is we've got to seek the Lord's will, not just look at other people and go, well, that's what they're doing, and well, this is what I'm doing, but really seek the Lord's will when handling His stuff. If it's God's stuff, then we need to not just do whatever we would think we naturally want to do with it, but do with it whatever He wants us to do with His stuff. So that's point number one. Don't trust in it. Now let's go through the rest of the points, and we'll do it fairly quickly. All right, point number one. So what do you do with money? Number one, don't trust in it. Number two, honor the Lord with it. Honor the Lord with it. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9 says, honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first produce of your entire harvest. The second half of this verse, I think, is talking about giving. When it says, honor the Lord with the first produce of your harvest, I think it's referring to something earlier in the Old Testament, talking about the first fruits that the Israelites would have. And when the first fruits came, they were to give them to the Lord, Yahweh. And so I'm going to talk about giving later on in this sermon. And so we'll talk about that kind of thing, I guess, or we'll refer to that a little bit later. But the first half of this verse I wanted to put real early up in the sermon. Honor the Lord with your possessions. If we're talking about what we're supposed to do with our stuff, I think that's one of the things we got to say up toward the top of the list. Honor the Lord with it. This is so basic and so foundational. Whatever it is that you do with your money, whatever you do with your stuff, your dining room table, your car, your couch, your paycheck, your retirement account, whatever it is, like what is it that you're supposed to do? Above all else, I think you're supposed to honor the Lord with your possessions, the way you use them, the way you borrow them, the way you loan them, the way you spend them, the way you save them, the way you give them, the way you share them. There's all sorts of things you do with stuff. But you have to honor the Lord with your possessions, because if it's His stuff, if all of our belongings are His belongings, and if He is worthy of all honor, then we need to honor Him with everything we do with our stuff. Not with 10% of our stuff, with all of our belongings. All right, number three. So what do you do with wealth? What do you do with riches? What do you do with money? Number one, don't trust in it. Number two, honor the Lord with it. Number three, earn it honestly. We get this from Proverbs. Earn it honestly. Proverbs 13, verse 11 says, wealth obtained by fraud will dwindle, but whoever earns it through labor will multiply it. Good to know. So apparently there's one way to earn money, and it's good to do it that way. How is it? By working for it. So if you work for money, you'll get more of it. Thumbs up to you. However, there's apparently another way to obtain wealth, and it's not by labor, it's by tricking people out of it. And Proverbs says that's not what you're supposed to do. In fact, you will not be blessed in that way. That's not the way it is meant to work. Wealth obtained by fraud will dwindle, but whoever earns it through labor will multiply it. Another verse along these lines under this topic would be Proverbs 11, verse 1. It says, dishonest scales are detestable to the Lord, but an accurate weight is his delight. Now, if you don't understand much about the culture that this verse was written in, this verse could make no sense to you at all. Because you go, wait a minute, dishonest scales? I didn't even know God would really cared a lot about scales. And an accurate weight? My bathroom scale's a little bit off. But I didn't know that God had real strong feelings about that, right? Ooh, detestable. And I have a friend who's got this real fancy scale that measures not just pounds, but all the way to ounces. And I didn't know, God really likes her scale way more than mine? And the answer to that is no. This verse has nothing to do with your bathroom scale. This is in a culture, an agricultural culture, where things were bought and sold by the pound. And so if you're buying barley or wheat or figs or grapes or olives or whatever it may be, you're buying the stuff by pound. You're using a scale to decide this is how much you owe me for this amount of stuff. And I think back then people were savvy enough that they could figure out, you know what? I could increase my profits this year by 10% multiple ways. One way that I could increase my profit this year by 10% would be to produce 10% more grapes, 10% more barley. Another way I could increase my profits 10% is make it appear as if I'm selling 10% more. Because just looking at it on the scale, that will be very hard. If I rig the scale, it'll be very hard to be able to judge an extra 10 or 10% less figs. And so I think that what God is saying here is not anything about your bathroom scale. He's saying that whole thing, well, I'm going to make profit not by selling more, but by getting more for the same thing. That kind of dishonesty is detestable to the Lord. So earn it honestly. So what are you to do with money? Don't trust in it. Honor the Lord with it. Earn it honestly. And number 4, provide for yourself and your household. This is something you see all over the Bible, and it is assumed you're supposed to do this with money, that you are to provide for yourself and your household. Proverbs 28:19 says, "The one who works his land will have plenty of food, but whoever chases fantasies will have his fill of poverty." Again, an agricultural culture that this is being spoken to. The one who works his land will have plenty of food. But apparently there's someone who puts in some kind of effort. He's chasing, but the thing he's chasing isn't really there. And so if you're chasing things that are not really there, that's going to lead to poverty. But what you should do is work. And if you do work, you'll have plenty of what? Food. So provide for yourself and your household. It's not wrong to have plenty of food. It's not wrong to work hard and then produce lots of food. It's not wrong to eat the food. And I assume that this is obviously written to farmers talking about food, but the principle would apply to things outside of farming and agriculture. I mean, even back then, if you were someone back then and your job was the blacksmith, you can't eat the horseshoes and the swords and stuff, right? Obviously, that person would work and then sell the horseshoes and swords for money and then use the money to buy the food and then eat the food. And so it's the same thing, but it's a little bit different. The point is not just that it's okay to have food and eat it. I think the point is it's okay to make money and spend it. It's okay to work hard, make money, and then use it. And you are to use it to provide for yourself and your household. Here's another proverb that talks about this. Proverbs 27:23-27. "Know well the condition of your flock, and pay attention to your herds, for wealth is not forever, not even a crown lasts for all time." That should sound familiar. I just read it to you earlier, but now I'm just going to complete the paragraph. Okay? What it says after that is, "When hay is removed, and new growth appears, and the grain from the hills is gathered in, lambs will provide your clothing, and goats the price of a field. There will be enough goat's milk for your food for your household, and nourishment for your female servants." The idea here is that these people on these farms were supposed to use their stuff to meet their needs. Not only did the food that they grow was something that they were supposed to use, but they were supposed to use it for the members of their household. It's not just food, it's also clothing, the verse says. Lambs will provide your clothing. It says that goats will provide the price of a field. I assume that means that they were either selling the goats or selling the goat's milk or something like that in order to purchase a field. But the idea is I do this work and I use the work in order to have enough to provide for myself and my household. We're supposed to do that with money. All right, number 5. What do you do with money? Don't trust in it. Honor the Lord with it. Earn it honestly. Provide for yourself and your household. And plan ahead. Number 5 is plan ahead. Proverbs 20, verse 4 says, "The slacker does not plow during planting season. At harvest time he looks, and there is nothing." You get it? "The slacker does not plow during planting season. At harvest time he looks, and there is nothing." This one is similar to some of the verses we looked at last week as far as the laziness leading to poverty. But this verse has a time element to it. Do you see? There's a time period called planting season where he's not working. Then there's another time period later called harvest time, and he looks, and there is nothing. That means there's some day where the lazy guy gets up and he goes, "I'm not in the mood." And then I guess it doesn't really affect his life that day. But months down the road, a new day comes, and he wakes up and he looks at all this stuff, and then he looks at all of his neighbors' fields, and they've all got food coming up out of their fields. And he goes, "Why is there nothing coming out of my dirt?" The reason nothing's coming out of your dirt is several months ago, there was a day where you did nothing. And so you have to plan ahead. There was a day months ago that this day right now, which was in the future then, was a day you should have been thinking about back then. When it comes to finances, one must think ahead. Here's another example, or another thing that falls under plan ahead. Proverbs 21, verse 20. Precious treasure and oil are in the dwelling of a wise person, but a foolish man consumes them. Love this Bible verse. And I think it's a Bible verse that teaches us about saving, the importance of saving. The reason I say it's about saving is because it says that precious treasure and oil are in the dwelling of the wise person, but a foolish man does what? He consumes them. That's interesting. The proverb does not say that the wise man has such a high income that his house is filled with precious treasure and oil, and the foolish man has such a low income that he doesn't have any treasure and oil. That's not the verse. No. These things, the precious treasure and oil, they're in the dwelling of the wise, and the foolish man consumes what? The precious treasure and oil. It seems as though this proverb is saying that the foolish man and the wise man both have access to the same precious treasure and oil. But what did they do with it? One of them consumed all of it. One of them spent every single penny. The other one consumed how much of it? Well, we don't know. He must have consumed some of it. He had to survive. But he did not consume all of it. How do we know? Because it's still there, sitting in his house. The wise man and the foolish man both had an income. They both had access to treasure and oil. One of them spent every bit of it, swallowed it all up, and the other one did not. And that's why it's sitting there in his house. Saving is important. Wise people do not consume all of their stuff. Also under the category of plan ahead, I just want to talk a little bit about debt and loans, because Proverbs talks a little bit about debt and loans. Proverbs 22 verse 7 says this: "The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is a slave to the lender." This is related to planning ahead. Rich rule over the poor, and I really want to focus on the second half of this one. The borrower is a slave to the lender. If you are looking for a Bible verse that talks positively about borrowing, this is not your verse, all right? Because slavery is not good, but it's saying there is a way to borrow, there's a way to make an agreement now, there's a way to spend now that causes your future labor to be owned by someone else. The borrower is the slave to the lender. Now you might go, "Oh goodness, Mario, is this saying that it's a sin to borrow? Like, is the Bible saying that, because I got a mortgage on my house and there's a loan for this and that. Like, is this verse saying that anytime anybody borrows anything, it is certainly a sin? And I borrowed my grandma's umbrella the other day, and is borrowing a sin in every single occasion? No, let me remind you, this book is called Proverbs. This is not a list of commands. This is not a list of laws. This is just saying the way the world works is that you can get into a situation where you buy stuff you don't have money for, and you make agreements about the future, and now somebody else owns your time and labor. This isn't a law. This is a watch out. Don't enslave yourself. And then this is Proverbs 22, verses 26 through 27. It says, "Don't be one of those who enter agreements, who put up security for loans. If you have no money to pay, even your bed will be taken from under you." Now, I don't think this one's about a personal loan, looking into it. When it talks about someone who puts up security for loans, I think this is putting up security for someone else's loan. This is, I think, the equivalent of co-signing a loan for someone else. And if they don't pay it off, you have to pay it off. And it's saying, watch out. Don't do that. Because there are these agreements where they go, well, I'll pay it off. And then when they don't, it's up to you. And the assumption is you agreed to pay off something you don't have the money for, right? Because it says if you have no money to pay. And I'm assuming this is in the future. This is you, like one day in the future, it may be payment time and you don't have the money. And if you have no money to pay, even your bed will be taken from under you. In other words, there are agreements that you could make right now that will affect your life next year. So you've got to think that through. We talked about this earlier on in the book of Proverbs because it came up, I think, in chapter 6. And I gave you that quote. I didn't even make it up, but I heard it from somewhere that it's today is a domino that touches tomorrow, and tomorrow is a domino that touches the next day, and the next day is a domino that touches the next day. And you have to realize the you and the decisions you're making now affect the you and the decisions you'll make 3 months from now, 3 years from now. And this proverb is saying that. You've got to be so careful what you're signing, Because there may be a day they come and march into your house and take your bed out. And so all of that is plan ahead. It can't just be, I just think about this moment. There are moments to come that we've got to think through when it comes to our money. So what do you do with money? Don't trust in it. Honor the Lord with it. Earn it honestly. Provide for yourself and your household. Plan ahead and give it away. And give it away. There are so many Bible verses about giving. There are so many Bible verses about giving money away. There's so many Proverbs about giving money away. I'm just going to read 4 of them. Proverbs 11, verse 24 says, "One person gives freely, yet gains more. Another withholds what is right, only to become poor." This is a very interesting proverb. Some people call it a paradoxical proverb. It's a paradox because it almost seems to contradict itself. One person gives freely, yet gains more. Another withholds what is right, only to become poor. There's a person who's giving, and you'd think giving, the result of giving would be you'd have less. That's what giving is. You give, you have less, because you gave it away. But this one says, no, giving, and then they gain more. And then the opposite, and then there's one who withholds. And you think if you withhold, well, then I'm going to have it, right? Precious treasure and oil are in the house of the wise. I withhold it. But apparently there's a way to withhold what is right. There is a certain amount of giving that we're supposed to do, but it can be held. And then what's interesting is you think, well, if you withheld it, well, you'd just be bad and rich. But it says only to become poor. And so it seems that what God is saying, and specifically in Proverbs, that there's something about the way God designed things, that when people are generous, there is a blessing that falls back on them. When someone is generous, there's a blessing that comes to them. And the book of Proverbs seems to especially emphasize that that blessing often comes back onto somebody in this life before you die. That a generous person is generous in this life, and the reward for their generosity is seen in this life. However, it is also true that the reward for generosity can come after this life. And Jesus said that. In the book of Luke, he talked about being generous and God rewarding you later on at the resurrection of the righteousness, at the resurrection of the righteous. And so there is a blessing that comes either in this life or in the next, or both, that comes with generosity, and it seems to be the reverse is true, that there's a stinginess. And that stinginess of withholding what is right brings a curse upon a person. And sometimes that curse, or the negative things that are associated with stinginess, it affects the stingy person in this life. And then if not in this life, you could be punished for it for after this life, for withholding what is right. Proverbs 11, verse 25 says, "A generous person will be enriched, and one who gives a drink of water will receive water." A very similar principle. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9 says, "Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first produce of your entire harvest." We should honor the Lord with all of our possessions, but this particular part seems to be saying this was written to the Israelites during this time period when they understood the first fruits belonged to Yahweh and they were to give them to God. And then Proverbs 22, verse 9 says, "A generous person will be blessed, for he shares his food with the poor." A generous person will be blessed, for he shares his food with the poor. This might be one of the holiest things that you can do with money. I think giving may be one of the holiest things that you can do with money. I don't think it's the only thing you're supposed to do with money. Clearly, there's money that you're supposed to use money to provide for yourself. You're supposed to use money to take care of your family. You're supposed to save. You're supposed to plan ahead. Giving is not the only thing you do with your money, but I think it is one of the holiest things that you can do with your money. Because, I guess let me put it this way. It is obvious that you can overspend. It is obvious that you can overborrow. Maybe less obvious, but I think it's still obvious you can oversave to the point of hoarding. But I cannot think of a single place in the Bible where we are warned about overgiving. I can't think of one. Maybe it's possible. Maybe it's possible to overgive. But it must happen so rarely that the Bible doesn't even bother to devote a verse to it. At least not that I can think of. I can think of passages that would warn us to not oversave or not overspend or not overborrow. I cannot think of a place in the Bible that warns us about overgiving. Maybe it's that we're supposed to spend whatever it is we need to spend, and we're supposed to save whatever it is we need to save, and give the rest away. But I can't think of a time the Bible warns us about overgiving. So let me end with this. In the New Testament now I'm talking about, giving is connected to the gospel. In the New Testament, giving is connected to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And one of the people that makes the connection between giving and Jesus Christ is Paul in the book of 2 Corinthians. And so I want to read the verse to you. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9 says this. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. This is a somewhat famous Bible verse. And it's found in a chapter, and I would challenge you to read the whole chapter this afternoon or wherever if you haven't. It's found in a chapter, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, where Paul is trying to get the Corinthians to give. He's trying to get them to give money, particularly to these other Christians who are poorer than them. And as he's trying to convince them to give money away, he says this, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, though he was rich, for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. What does that even mean? The Apostle Paul says Jesus was rich. I didn't think he was. How is he rich? It says Jesus is rich. I didn't think he was. I think that the Apostle Paul is referring to Jesus before he came here. Before that first Christmas, as a baby in a manger. He's God in heaven, in the glory of heaven, and he's rich. How do you know he's rich? Well, what did he own? Everything. Correct answer. He owned everything. You don't get richer than that. He owned everything, and then he comes to this earth and becomes a human being who owns nothing. Even incredible to even think about the fact that he would go from the glory of heaven down to earth. If he had just chosen to come down here and become a rich human being, that would have been quite a condescension. To go from owning everything to just being a rich guy on earth would have been a huge drop. He didn't even do that. He came down and became a poor person, not just a poor person by God's standards. He came down and became a poor person by human standards. And then lived a life of righteousness for us. And then died on the cross for our sins. And when he died on the cross for our sins, he gave how much of himself to us? All of it. Isn't that incredible? Think about it. For God to save you, for Jesus Christ to save you, he did not make a donation. He did not give 20% of himself or 5% of himself. He gave 100% of himself to save us, so that those of us who are poor, and I think we are spiritually and physically poor from God's perspective, that we would be rescued and we would live forever with God in his riches. And that's the gospel. And that's a gospel presentation that's given, and this is interesting, it's a gospel presentation that Paul is giving not to unbelievers. If you read the chapter, Paul is not talking to unbelievers and saying, this is the gospel. He's talking to believers in Jesus Christ, and he gives them this gospel presentation to say to them, be generous like Jesus was. This passage is also not a bad segue into celebrating the Lord's Supper. Because when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, specifically when we take the bread, remember what Jesus said? He said, this is my body that's given for you. He gave us his body, his self. That's what we celebrate when we do Lord's Supper. Kenan is going to come up here in a minute or two, and he's going to explain more about Lord's Supper. But let me go ahead and pray between now and then. God, I thank you for this truth and this wisdom. And it's weird, I don't know. Standing up here, it's, I think, easier than when you're sitting in the crowd to get a feel for the room, like the mood or the tone in the room. And it seems to me like this sermon hit a lot more seriously or solemnly than I expected it to. I don't know what you're doing. But I thank you for it. I pray that you would help us to trust in you, to honor you with all our stuff. I pray you'd help us to be wise people who plan ahead and who provide for our families and who are honest in our business dealings and in our earning of money. And I pray you'd help us to give the right amount away. And we thank you for Jesus, and we thank you that you gave you to us. I pray that you'd help us as best as we can, that we would give us to you. And as we celebrate Lord's Supper, we thank you. We thank you for the gospel. We thank you that you would give your body and blood to us. Amen.